too long, and last night I think God was saying, like, don't edit it, just like trust me to show you on the spot, like what to say. And I'm like, that's scary. I'm not good at thinking on my feet, but I need that to remember to depend on Jesus. So, yes, let's pray. Dear God, I just want to ask you to speak through me.
Yes,
If
God.
it is not you, it is dust. And with you is the fountain of life. And you are who you are, and I'm just a human, and I don't always know what's true and what's not true about you. So I just want to ask you to use my words to speak your truth to each person present, to speak what each person needs to hear. I just dedicate this all to you. In Jesus' name we pray. So I would like to start with a song just called He Has Time. And I can't remember who wrote it, but it goes like this. Something's been stolen under the weight of the curse. You've been broken. You're not what happened. You're more than the shame you were recklessly given. You silently scream through the tears you can't keep from falling, wishing they'd pour out enough to break through the hurting. Jesus runs after the broken ones, weeping with those who weep, crowns them with purity, and years of shame shatter in Jesus' name. You can't shake the feeling. He's not in a rush. He has time for your healing. Lean on his shoulder. It's never too late, and your story's not over. You wish you could go back in time, rewrite your own ending, but then you find faith to believe that it's just the beginning. Jesus runs after the broken ones, weeping with those who weep, crowns them with purity, and years of shame shatter in Jesus' name. For he is here, and he has time to take what's wrong and make it right. And he is here, and he has time to take what's wrong and make it right. And Jesus runs after the broken ones, weeping with those who weep, crowns them with purity, and years of shame shatter in Jesus' name. So yes, after being invited to share about my walk with God, I went to Jesus and asked, like, what aspects of my walk? He's been so beautiful and good. There's so much that's happened between me and him. I felt like he was inviting me to share about healing he has been doing in my life, of memories of childhood trauma, which is anything but a topic I can describe in the past tense. Like, okay, it was horrible, and now Jesus came, and it's all hunky-dory. It's really smack in the middle of that story. And revisiting that pain with him and talking it over with him for almost the first time. So it's just like a story in the middle, which really at the end of the day, I guess that's what all of our stories with God are like until we get to heaven. So yes, and I guess, I'm diving into things that were painful and things that were hard. And so before that, I just, which means that a bunch of things that were beautiful, I'm not going to get to. And so I just want to say first off, I think even in all the ways that I was a difficult child and that things were really hard is testament to the unconditional love of those around me and all the things that were beautiful. So, yes. Growing up, every summer my family and I would go to a music camp in the Sierra foothills east of Fresno, and it was like a second home to me. A favorite part of the summer, I anticipated it eagerly all year. I remember one time I was like, it's July 14th. How many days until July 14th, Ryan, Daddy? And I'm like,
it's only January, dear.
Yeah. And you know, I just felt this bond with that land and with that place and with that community. The smell, the pungent smell of the bare clover in the air and the thick warm dust under my bare feet and the big ponderosa pines with their gentle fragrance in their trunks if you put your nose up to them. And just the way that the wind sang in the green pine needles. You could look up at the sky and there's the pine needles against the sky. And just all those little dirt roads. I explored all the little dirt roads and all the little paths. There were little like stairs, little magical stairways carved into the hillsides. And you'd go up the hills and you'd find these mossy rocks with lichen on them. And I would dance my heart out and eat the sticky manzanita berries. You could literally stick them to your hand and like carry them along, and they were just stuck to your hand, and you would eat them off gradually. And swam in the silky water, the big pond with the cattails, the green cattails around the edges, and the really tall rushes. And then in the drought in 2013 to 15, there was this tragedy struck. You know, we went up in 2015, and amongst the green pine trees, there's just all these brown ones. And, you know, their drought had weakened the trees, and unusually warm winters had helped the bark beetles survive. And there was this big old epidemic, and when we went back in 2016, nearly every pine tree was dead. Like, we just went up the hill, and we go up there, and we underneath this canopy of brown trees. And, like, they're all in the same place as they were, but they're dead. And there we are camping underneath this dead tree needle canopy. And we didn't go back after that, not for 7 years. And there was this trauma and scarring inside me that this, my other homeland where I had been coming since I was in my mother's belly, it was dead. That's how it felt to me. And the route there had changed as well. Like when we were going up in 2016, you know, where there had once been these rural golden hills basking in the sun, you know, every year we'd go through these hills. There was now like all these new half-finished housing developments, and like it's just changing. And the sprawl outside of Fresno spreading into the hills, the pine trees had died. It just felt like everything had changed and everything had perished.
Wow. And
it just made me think of this other song, this little verse from Oft on a Stilly Night by Thomas Moore. It says, when I remember all those friends so linked together, I've seen around me fall like leaves in wintry weather. I feel as one who treads alone some banquet hall deserted, whose lights are fled, whose garlands dead, and all but he are parted. You know, someday I think sometimes I'll go back there, just kind of to see it one last time, maybe, that land that had once been lush with pine forest, and I'll just kind of go back, but I would think of it in sort of the past tense, returning to experience something that had been, but wasn't anymore. Experienced, you know, the adult me experiencing, who wasn't the same person as the kid who'd once played on those fragrant, dusty hillsides. Yeah. That kid wasn't me anymore. At least I didn't want to have any connection with that kid. It's the thing, the part of my life between maybe age 4-ish and when I gave my life to Christ at age 13 is something I wish desperately didn't exist. I've been deeply, deeply ashamed of that childhood version of myself who was very consumed in sour anger and really clueless what to do with her vivid emotional experiences. And, you know, I thought of that time period as my dark ages, and its existence kind of hung over me like this smoke cloud. Like you could see the wildfire smoke cloud, and I'm like, I'm going to look at the blue sky over there, but there's the smoke cloud. Wow. So, yeah, and it always felt immensely relieving to be around people who didn't know me then. You know, not so comfortable to be around people who did. I didn't want to have any connection with that Eleanor, but I do. I still get overwhelmed by my emotions, and I still hurt really bad over the fallenness of the world. I still love plants. I still get all jump and dance excited about things and want to cry lots of big tears about other things. And all these things that are the same. And yeah, it feels like a pit of slime. That's like that wound, like Jeremiah 30:12-13 says, your wound is incurable, your injury beyond healing. There is no one to plead your cause, no remedy for your sore, no healing for you. Like my childhood trauma was hazardous waste that couldn't be broken down and neutralized, so the best thing that could be done was seal it up somewhere and hope it didn't leak out.
Wow.
I could believe intellectually, but never feel in my emotions that Jesus forgives me and remembers my sins no more. Emotionally, it just always felt like that messy childhood me was unforgivable, this just sort of eternally loathsome kind of cancerous thing that was attached to me, and I couldn't break the cords.
Wow.
So yeah, it starts with the fact that I was blessed and cursed from birth with immense emotional sensitivity, that I feel things big, whether it's delight or sorrow, and the world has fallen. The sad things and the broken things and the messed up things in this world sink in deep for me, and they always have. It's just, yeah, it's not very easy to be that sensitive and to have that just all the things that are so, it would be a beautiful thing to be in heaven. And here on earth, it's just like, yeah. And so when I was, back when I was 6, I just remember being completely overwhelmed by just as I discovered more and more how broken the world is, and just all the things, big and little, and just so overwhelmed, just every single pain that I witnessed or heard about, and just didn't have any idea how to respond. And then I had all these other sensitivities too, like loud noises were overwhelmingly loud, and startling things were unbearably startling, and ordinary amounts of stimulation overloaded my system. So just like, here's me in this crazy world.
Wow.
But for some reason I'm blessed with memories of age 3 and under, and my family and I lived in Princeton, New Jersey, and that was like this, it always felt like this feels like this kind of mythical, almost like before the fall sort of time. I didn't know about all the evil things in the world. Yeah, like I was scared of some things, like when I looked behind the curtain and there's a pulley, and I thought, it's got an evil eye. It just looked like it has this evil eye staring at me, and I'm like, it's a darking light. It's going to suck up all the light and take it away. And so, there's that kind of stuff, and I was terrified of smoke detectors blinking, and I didn't want to go down the hall, but none of those things, it's not like the kind of just distorted things and the evil things, and that I didn't know about, and just everything about the world and everything about life was like a new discovery in a garden of delights. We lived on a half-acre lot, and my parents had filled with beauty in just every place, gardens and orchards and flowers, so many flowers, and just so many beautiful garden spaces. And I'd go put my nose in the great big moonflower blossoms when they unfurled in the evening and smell them, and skip around in the warm rain. There's amazing thunder showers, and watch the lightning flashes from like all the different directions lighting up the rain, and just everything was a garden of delights. And then I think it was after we moved out to California that I started kind of like internalizing the existence of evil, like the things that reeked, the things that kind of tasted salty in a completely different way from everything in the good world tasted, and the things that made you want to stare or else hide your face because something was off. And so began my dark ages, like emotionally sensitive and open in every pore to embrace the myriad goodnesses of the world. I'm bombarded with the realities of fallenness. And at the same time growing in self-awareness, realizing that my parents were humiliated and stressed out when I screamed. And I didn't know what to do with my emotions, and I didn't know how to face all the things, from tiny to huge, that I came upon, tragic, broken, distressing, unjust, and so on, just, from the littlest things to the biggest things. Or for that matter, just the things that were loud, and the things that were too scary, and the things that were too overstimulating. I would kind of shut down, and I would burst out screaming, and I began more and more over time to respond with anger. Like, I would just get so overwhelmed by these things I'd experienced that didn't seem right, and I just started getting eaten by anger and just gnawed away inside, because those images of what I saw and heard about and experienced, they were vivid in my mind. That's the other thing. I tend to see things in my mind really vividly, and it's just, they were just unbearable because there they were. I couldn't forget them. And there wasn't anyone in my life at the time to teach me what to do with emotions, so I was just kind of like thrashing around in deep water, trying to grab onto everything, just like to keep it from going wrong. So I ended up becoming kind of a little tyrant, like a little self-righteous moral dictator, because like, how do we keep all this awful stuff from happening? I can't bear it if it happens, so I kind of like, hang on. So I had all these different moral principles that I just fought tooth and nail to try to make everyone around me uphold, because it just didn't know how to deal with it when like things happen that seemed like this cannot happen, this cannot happen. So I just threw my ferocity and willpower into keeping it from happening. I think I felt like I could kind of ward off a little of the world's brokenness by throwing my will everywhere I could with a lot of force. It's like, this wrong cannot be done, so I have to do something because otherwise I can't face it. And so, there's just things like I thought parents had a moral duty to comfort their kids when their kids cried. It was not so much about whether I got comforted. It's like, this is the way the world should be. And so, like, one time when I had a tantrum and my mom didn't do what I thought she was supposed to do, I just tried to make myself keep having a tantrum so that she wouldn't get rewarded for doing what I was convinced was the wrong thing, because that seemed like that would be some kind of abomination, and like somehow I have to prevent this thing.
Wow.
And then there were just like things that were super, like I thought that you shouldn't, that it was like wrong to throw away trash at some point when I don't know, it was 5 or 6, and it's like, because that would be disrespectful of like this stuff, these things, you throw it away. And so I would hoard it up and just try to hang on to it and put it in the corner of the living room and keep anyone from throwing it away. And then I'd make these kind of models of things that I was really convinced of the truth. Like I basically had this whole idea that I didn't question. The reason why parents tell kids what to do is because the parents of the world are trying to use the kids for basically slave labor. Because obviously it seemed like parents seemed to have privilege over the kids, and the parents had the right to tell kids what to do, but not vice versa. The kids were subordinate to the parents, and the parents were benefiting, so somehow, this must have been established by the parents for their own benefit, and I have a sacred obligation to rebel in order to overthrow it. So here I am, this like little 6-year-old me, deciding I'm like, I am going to make all these rules, and thou must not respect thy parents, and so I was like, I was also so like, from maybe age 4 or something, just like, was really enamored with the idea of like suffering for the sake of like protesting something like wrong. I would have pretense about it when I was like really young, and so I was like, I want to go rebel against my parents and get into really bad trouble. And so, but in fact, but my parents didn't make very many rules, so there was like this one rule, and I'm like, I am going to break it. I'm going to set out to break it. And so like I break this rule and nothing happens, and I'm so disappointed. Like I wanted to get into that really, really bad trouble. And there were other things like that too. Like I would do these things, and I wanted this moment to come where they like confront me and like, the consequences of this, and this is what's going to happen, and I stand up and make my statement about the wrong system that I'm imposing, and it's really exciting. But anyways, no, any case, there's like, and then on a slightly different note, like one time I decided I was going to go around the house. I was going to kill every spider because, spiders are really bad. They don't have a right to live because they make their living wrapping up flies and sticky webbing and paralyzing them and sucking out their insides. And I'd watch this, I'm like, this is terrible. So I'm going to go around and make war against all the spiders and kill them all. Until my dad said, what I was doing to the spiders was as bad as what they were doing to the flies. And I was like, okay, that makes sense to me. Anyways, there were a lot of things like that. And I had this group of pretend people called the preventer people, and I just totally worshipped them. Like they'd go around like forcibly keeping wrong from being done. Like not like with violence, but definitely with kind of like force and just a lot of anger. And that was me. They were like my heroes. And it was just, and as I got older, I started really loathing my anger and my ferocity, but it was really deeply ingrained, and I didn't know what to do about it. So like I promised myself, now I'm getting to, age 10 or 11, and it's like, I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to scream at somebody when they do something that I think is wrong again. And then one day, I see someone hit a dog. I'm so overwhelmed at the dog's pain, and I scream, and I just ran away in shame. Like, I couldn't keep myself. I did this terrible thing. And I think that I also ended up like feeling more shame because I felt this responsibility. Since I had pushed so hard to make people do what I wanted, and because I also knew that I intended to like not, I was very strong-willed. I wouldn't stop like if people were more like pushing back. I felt like when my parents were blamed for like not being able to control me, that it was my fault. And I was the one, and I was disgracing my parents, and that just, I had a lot of shame about that. And that somehow I disgraced my whole family. And then I also felt guilty when the adults around me did do the things I was trying to get them to do, because it's like I'd manipulated them, and I could never knew if something was out of love or because I'd pushed. And that meant that I don't think I ever really trusted my parents' love or anyone around me's love. It was always like, maybe if they did something beautiful or good, it was like, well, I'm pushing with all my fierce might to try to make people uphold moral principles. Maybe that's why they did it. And so I didn't trust anything, like any love.
Wow.
And I also felt very misunderstood because I don't think anyone knew what was going on. I wasn't really old enough to communicate my internal states, so there's just like, yeah, so it just kind of felt like, okay, I'm being blamed for wanting control. My parents are being blamed for letting me have control, and nobody will come and just cry with me over how hard it was to bear the evil in the world, because there's just, it was kind of an enigma, and I just, yeah. So there you go. And in the midst of all these struggles, Jesus also wasn't the center of my life or my family's life. Like, my family has grown a lot in godliness. At that point, there was sort of more of an unmooredness and more of a sort of chaoticness and kind of general exaltation of rebellious attitudes, sort of like, we're gonna, I don't know, yeah, there's kind of some of those things. And I was also immersed in an ocean of just a lot of different worldviews around me. And I would kind of go running after, like I yearned for that something more, that something bigger, and I'd kind of go running after it, like wherever I saw it. And that was spooky when I didn't have Jesus in the center. That was like, I would make up my pretend spiritual rituals and like go do them. And I really don't like remembering that, because they have this kind of sense of like there's something there and I don't know if I like that something. So yeah, sometimes I just wanted to be part of a home that seemed upright and orderly and righteous. Like the best thing in the world, if I had parents who had authority and that authority was truly righteous, and I wanted to follow their rules because there was righteousness behind them. It wasn't something to rebel against. And their windows, like their faces were windows to God's beauty. Like Gordon and Joan Smith at High Street Church had faces that just struck me because God was in them. I wanted to be like them, and I wanted to have faces like theirs. And, you know, the faces of people who were close to Jesus were my best argument for the truth of Christianity. Like, all kinds of spiritual things seemed interesting, but it was only Christianity that gave people faces like that. So when I came to Jesus at the age of 13, that thick, sour core of anger melted away, and I was free from it.
Wow.
I hadn't been able to get rid of it, but Jesus did. No longer was I alone in this horribly messed up world, but I was a beloved child of the King who loved the world so much he suffered agonizing torment in order to break the curse of evil. You know, I knew the King who'd already won, who'd already vanquished evil's might, who hated evil as more than I did and didn't respond to it through tyrannical force. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers. And roughly quoting Laura Gaskell, God is not going to spiritually restrain people's souls until they cooperate. He is kinder than that, even when they are doing great evil. He is not only just, he is kind. So I had a new role model, a new Lord of my life. And I had only to picture his kingly hands stretched out on the cross and that face full of love and anguish, to have my own heart soften, rejoice, and bow in wonder.
Wow.
And so I spent a lot of time as a new Christian dwelling on identity and just kind of gradually thinking and meditating and learning that I was God's beloved. But in my relationship with Jesus grew, and in going to therapy, I began to gradually learn about how to interact with all those emotions, but those childhood dark ages, I locked them up in a box, and everything and anything which reminded me of them I pushed away. And that was a lot of things that were just anything about me as a kid. I loved plants. Well, I didn't, as a teenager, I didn't even want to love plants. I didn't want to be hurt by injustice. I just wanted to be sort of morally callous in high school. And I went off and gossiped with friends and talked about dirty stuff and thought, oh, look, I'm reformed. I'm not that little self-righteous tyrant.
Wow.
So, yeah. And you know, some of those things kind of gradually came back, and there's been lots of healing, but more recently, what I didn't know, you know, I've always told myself stories in order to help process things, and what I didn't know is that I'd be telling a story in which I was a 6-year-old. I didn't want to, because I wanted that gulf between the adult and the kid me to just stay. I didn't want to think about being a 6-year-old, but God has different ideas. Sometimes it seems that he who is able to do immeasurably more than all we can ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us, doesn't just want to take care of that hurt by locking it up in a box and disposing of it like hazardous waste.
Wow.
Throughout the Bible, there's all these threads where God isn't just locking up the problem somewhere, he's redeeming and healing it. Behold, he says in Revelation, I'm making all things new. All things, including my childhood box of hazardous waste?
Wow.
There's a verse in Jeremiah that gives me a little jolt of wonder and surprise when I read it. It says, and the entire valley of dead bodies and of the ashes, and all the fields as far as the brook of Kidron to the corner of the horse gate toward the east shall be holy to the Lord. Jeremiah 31:40. What's happening here? The valley full of dead bodies and ashes will be holy to the Lord? Well, this is the same God who made the dry bones into living people again in the book of Ezekiel. This is the same God who didn't throw out humankind when we fell and completely failed to live up to his image he made in us. But he came into our sad world, his good world we'd ruined so badly, took our sorrows on himself, died so we could live. He works to restore us, to sanctify us, to make us like him, to take the valleys of dead bodies and ashes that are our own sin-ravaged lives and make them holy to the Lord.
Wow.
My family and I do a thing together where we create stories set in an imaginary country and play the characters in them. And it's really amazing because we get to sink into the internal world of those characters and kind of experience their lives in a little way. And so we tend to explore themes about where God is in the midst of incredibly difficult times. So about a month or so ago, in one of our stories, I began playing a 6-year-old girl named Alma.
Wow.
I felt like God wanted me to act her part, but the problem was I had no idea how to act the part of a 6-year-old because I couldn't imagine being that age. I'd erected such a wall in my mind, inside of me, that I just couldn't get there internally. I just couldn't get inside of her. So the only thing, and I didn't have any idea how closely connected this character Alma's situation was to mine as a 6-year-old. I wasn't even thinking about it. I just knew that I felt God was calling me to play her, and I didn't know how. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to dig out that folder of notes from my mother made when I was that age, and I'm going to read them, and I'm going to try to actually remember what it was like at all these different times. And that's the first time I'd done that in ages and ages. And so in our story, Alma and her family have been they've been in prison. It's this really horrible situation. As we have these stories about where is God in these really the most evil thing you can think of, and where is God? So Alma, she's been in prison in this institution that's using them as experimental subjects, and Alma is housed in a room with other kids, including a 13-year-old named Eva, and Alma loves and admires Eva very much. Eva's story is one of tragic injustice, as 3 years prior at age 10, she escaped a war-ridden country as a refugee after losing her whole family in a bombing raid. Against immense odds, she struggled out of the war-torn country and into the country where our story takes place. But when she arrived what she thought was a safe land in this country, she was deceived and taken advantage of as an undocumented orphan war refugee and sold to the laboratory as an experimental subject. So here's Eva, suffering the hideous injustice of this fallen world, and here's Alma witnessing all Eva is going through and not being able to save her from it. And, even though that's way more intense, objectively in some ways, than stuff I experienced, it's the same story. Mm-hmm. Here's the little 6-year-old girl. with just overwhelmed by the brokenness of the world, overwhelmed by injustice being inflicted on the loved one, not being able to save her from it, not being able to stop it. But this time Jesus is at the center of Alma's life. So I'm getting to relive my 6-year-old trauma with Jesus at the center.
Oh, wow.
And that changes the whole story. Instead of like it's completely horrific as what this character is going through, there's light because she knows the light of the world, and she is going to see the light of the world acting in the midst of the injustice, in the midst of Eva's life, and loving and supporting Eva. So it's just like it's the same story, but it's made new because Jesus is there. And she doesn't need to push back against the immensity of evil with her tiny little frail self because God himself is redeeming evil.
Wow.
So, yeah, and something else happened right in the middle of like we're telling this story, and then something else happens in our life because this year, last weekend, after 7 years, we went back to the camp, the music camp in the Sierras. And you know, not only had the pine trees died, but in 2020 they'd experienced a wildfire. And so they've just been through all these natural disasters. And some part of me felt like I was going back this one more time, this like some kind of new entity that I was, waving goodbye to a thing that was dead and that had belonged to somebody who wasn't me at all anyway. And so, you know, the land had changed and I had changed. We traveled there in a moonlit night. And you know, those new housing developments were enfolded in those sweet, warm nighttime and under that big sky and just upheld by those ancient golden hills. And the night was gentle and tender, and we climbed that mountain road, and through the open window came the smell of bear clover and the sound of the singing insects. And the headlights shone on young, plump ponderosas. We turned off on the little dirt road that leads to the camp, and we were driving through meadows of wildflowers. So many wildflowers, myriad pink clarkias and the gold daisies of the Madia elegans, and the land was alive and it was blooming. The open spaces left where the trees had died and the brush had burned were filled with flowers, ecosystems lush with biodiversity. And just makes me think of in Joel, you know, they have all those locusts come and they kill everything, and there's a horrible drought and it's just awful. And then God says, "Do not fear, O land, rejoice and be glad, for the Lord has done great things. Do not fear, beasts of the field, for the pastures of the wilderness have turned green. For the tree has borne its fruit, the fig tree and the vine have yielded in full. So rejoice, O sons of Zion, and be glad in the Lord your God. For he has given you the early rain for your vindication, and he has poured down for you the rain. The early and the latter rain is before. And he says, I will make up to you for the years that the locust has eaten." The story doesn't end with this devastation. It goes on. And the descriptions in the book of Joel of the devastation are very vivid and very relatable to me. And then, go on. So we parked and got out, and I skidded around in the moonlight trying to get my bearings, wading through grass with its prickly seeds catching in my shoes. Found the spot where we used to camp, which now was thick with grasses, gold grasses, and little green plants. I saw the lowlands that had once been a deep forest. Now it was a marshy, wet meadow. And that many-trunked gold cup oak I remembered was still there. Everything was so changed that we weren't able to locate a campsite in the dark, but we got a tarp and laid it down on what turned out to be a firebreak road and got some blankets, and we just bedded down with a gold cup oak on one side and a black oak on the other, and I was back. And there in the moonlight, I was just so aware of the presence of the Lord. I just sensed he was full of gladness to have brought me back and to share in this moment of reunion with this childhood treasure I thought was dead. And it just didn't even seem to matter if the rest of the trip was horrible. It was just like, this is consolation enough. I am here and it is not dead. As I lay there in the silent fragrance of that night, I just could sense the Lord holding all those like ragged, wounded threads of my life just close to his heart. And it just, you know, on the way up to church today, I thought, I know how to describe it. It's like that, a line in a song that we were practicing in choir. It says, each strand of sorrow has a place within this tapestry of grace. Like he wasn't holding them as something that he was tossing away in the trash can. He was holding them as something that he is redeeming, remembering, weeping over, redeeming, making new. And you know, everything was still there. The little rose, the dusty rose that we're so familiar. I could have walked them on a black, cloudy night. My feet knew them and my soul knew them, like intimate friends. And I wasn't a different person. I was the same one who had skipped over these paths with childhood delight 2 decades ago, who had sat on the lichen-encrusted rocks and smiled with wonder at the fiddle tunes, who had known the silky waters of that precious pond with its cattail-filled edges and seen the sky reflected in its water. He didn't replace me. He's making me new. He didn't bring me back to see a relic from childhood one last time. He brought me there to be there in new wholeness, all the things that had been beautiful and lovely, then beautiful and lovely in completeness, because Jesus was at the center of my life, because I belonged to him and him to me. The brightness which had been partial then was complete now, not thrown out or dead, but completed. And in the moonlight, my second night there, I sat in a pile of wide planks that were milled from the ponderosas, which had died from the bark beetles, and I sat and talked with my Lord. I looked over that land I knew so well. It was so rich with all of its memories that it held, and all those treasures from the past with all the ragged edges from my childhood. And I just thought of all the ways that God had blessed me in this place, all the way I'd felt safe under the shelter of so many kind adults in that community, the way I'd found such delight in all the beauties and all these things. And then I felt inside of me that spring of living water, the fountain of all life, in whose light the beautiful things are truly beautiful, and the ugliest things are covered in the beauty of his alpenglow. Yes, he loved me then, back in the childhood times, before I'd come into his arms. The dark ages were by no means devoid of his light. As I sat there on the board pile in the moonlight, I could see it, all those candle flames of his love in the darkness, like the love my earthly father has showed me again and again, the love of the heavenly Father. He's the one who'd come and rescue me in my nightmares as a kid. And so one time I was dreaming, sometime in real life as a kid, little kid, we almost didn't make it home from a trip, and there was going to be this sudden change of plans, which disconcerted me. Sudden changes of plans still disconcert me. And we were going to have to stay in a motel. And I got really traumatized by this and had a lot of nightmares, like we can't go home. We have to stay in a motel. And then, so one time I had this dream, and we couldn't get home. We were in this motel, and the walls and ceiling were bare white under these glaring overhead lights, and there were like all these like pipes and ducts running along the walls and the ceiling, and no furniture. And it's all hard, and it's all cold, and it's all lonely. And I was just terrified, just standing there in tears, standing there in that comfortless building where I had to sleep with no way in the world to go home. And then my dad showed up, cloaked in his great, tender, gentle love, and opened a door in the bare, white, pipe-covered wall. And what was on the other side but our own house? And when we went back through the door, the other part wasn't there. The motel wasn't there. It was our house. It was gone. And it just feels so much like Jesus' own redemption, like a sort of prefiguring, like a shadow. And, the beginning of my talk, I quoted Jeremiah 30, where God is telling Israel, your wound is incurable. But reading on a few lines, there's a surprise. But I will restore you to health and heal your wounds, declares the Lord. What? I thought he'd said the wound was incurable, and now he's going to heal it? Whoa, who are you, Lord? And I don't know, it's getting really late. I wrote a couple of more paragraphs, but I'm not sure what I should do. Go for it?
Yeah, go
okay. I find myself thinking of the big story of history. Back to the tragedy of the fall. Adam and Eve, God planted this garden of delights, and they were, they messed up, and they were thrown out of the garden, and that intimacy between them and God was shattered. And there they are, cast out, disgraced, separated from him. It's just like the ultimate tragedy, but the story doesn't end there. We can spoil the story and jump to the ending and read it. And beginning of Revelation 22. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and the Lamb, down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. There will be no more night. And they will not need the light of a lamp or the sun, for the Lord God will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever. The leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Once there was a tree that death came through, but this is a tree to bring healing to the nations so marred by the curse that came through the first tree. And I just want to end with one more little tiny piece of a song. You father the orphan, your kindness makes us whole. You shoulder our weakness, and your strength becomes our own. You're making me like you, clothing me in white, bringing beauty from ashes, for you will have your bride, free of all her guilt and rid of all her shame, and known by her true name. From Ever Be. I forget who wrote it, but it's called Ever Be. There you go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.